you will know of the novel by Charles Dickens called A Tale of Two Cities. The two cities being London and Paris in the 18th century, set in the time of the French Revolution. Sometimes that book's title is used to describe something that involves two cities. And we could apply it to the passages we have read just now. It's about the way God's providence appeared for Paul, and by extension to all of the Lord's people. The two cities here are Caesarea and Jerusalem, both important centres in New Testament times. Jerusalem, of course, being the capital of Israel, where the temple was, and therefore the religious centre of the nation. Caesarea was on the Mediterranean coast of Israel, about 70 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It was the next most important city because it was the Roman governor's residence, that of Felix, and after him Festus. And it was the headquarters of the Roman troops. And this background is what lies behind the passages we have read together, helps us to see what was happening in these two passages. Now, in chapter 23, Paul came to Jerusalem, and the Jews had tried to lynch him. But Roman soldiers intervened, but they let Paul come before the Jewish Sanhedrin, or council, to know what the Jews had against him. It was a mystery to the Romans. They couldn't get their heads around what the fuss was about. They had no knowledge of Jewish laws and customs and the conflict of the gospel with Judaism and why the Jews were wanting to kill Paul because of what he stood for and what he preached. So they were wanting to know what the problem was, how to act. Well, as we've read in the first part of chapter 23, the hearing collapsed into violence. And for Paul's safety, at the end of verse 10, the soldiers had to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him into the castle, or the fort. Now, from here, Paul might have travelled twice, involving these two cities. The first, recorded in chapter 23, verses 12 to 15, as we have read, that would have been within the city of Jerusalem, from prison in the Roman castle to the council hall again, under pretense of the Jews finding out more to accuse him, and the Romans understanding more about the problem. That was the first, within Jerusalem, from the prison to the council hall, or Sanhedrin. The second journey, in chapter 25, and at verse 3, that would have been from Caesarea to Jerusalem, again, for the same purpose. So the first within Jerusalem, and the second from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now, why do we mention this? Why is this so important? Well, in both cases, if Paul had made those journeys, his enemies, the Jews, would have ambushed him and killed him. But both times, he was kept from making these journeys by a kind and overruling providence. And both times, it saved his life. And we can see in these the typical way the Lord works for his people, for us in guidance and protection. Not directly or immediately. The Lord didn't send from heaven directly to intervene, deal with these Jews, rescue Paul. He used human means, instruments, and it's fascinating and instructive to see the instruments he used and how he worked. And I say this is on record because it's a typical example of how the Lord comes in for all of his people in certain situations of particular need. And what did the Lord use to save Paul's life, to preserve Paul's life in both these cases? Well, not what, but who. In the first case, it was a young boy. And in the second case, it was a great man. So let us look then at these. First of all, a young boy. Chapter 23, verse 16. And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, their plan to ambush Paul, and so on. Now here is Paul's nephew, and it's all that we know about the apostle's family. Perhaps his sister lived in Jerusalem, and her son had come to visit Uncle Paul. And it's a human touch. Now, the boy, Paul's nephew, overheard the plot that the Jews made. You have it recorded as we've read before that, but in verse 16, when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. But here it is, and that is verse 12, chapter 23. Certain of the Jews banded together, bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And they came to the chief priests and elders to tell them of this assassination plot, and that they should get the chief captain to agree for Paul to come from his prison to the council in Jerusalem. And that short journey would have been the end of him. But somehow the lad overheard this plot. And so there was no accident here. He was in the right place at the right time, as God ordered it. Seeming chance, but God directed his steps, brought him within earshot of these murderous Jews. In Ecclesiastes 10 and verse 20 we read, "A bird of the air shall carry the voice, and that which hath wings shall tell the matter." And that gives us the expression, "a little bird told me." You see, the Lord can bring knowledge of things said in secret out into the open in order for people to know about it. The Lord can do this. And so the nephew is able to tell Paul. Verse 16, he went into the castle and told Paul. And you notice in verse 15, we are ready to kill him, said the Jews, but God was ready to protect him. And so Paul, hearing of this from his nephew, informs a centurion who takes the boy to the chief captain, a higher ranking officer. The chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, "What is this that thou hast to tell me?" And just in passing, notice the tender gesture of the chief captain in verse 19. He took him by the hand, went with him aside privately, and asked, "What is it that thou hast to tell me?" If you think of the hand of that chief captain, it would have held a sword that would have killed many a man in battle, would have hurled javelins that would have felled many foes, would have had a short dagger thrust into many who would have killed him if possible. And so it's a rough, hard, calloused hand, a big, burly, rock-hard man. And yet he's got this tender action of taking the lad by the hand, saying, "Come with me, what have you got to tell me?" And the contrast is remarkable, isn't it? But in passing, the reason is this. It's summed up in the expression, the profession of arms. Because God has so ordered it that nations have mandated their standing armies and given them permission to kill enemies in defense of the realm. And that is a very noble and a right thing. And professional soldiers, and even those called up in time of war, with all their training and they're being sent into battle, it's not that they're killers, it's that they're willing to kill in order to save the lives of loved ones back home and to defend their nation. But when they come home again, after battle, after the war, they're ordinary people. And so it's perfectly possible for a man like this chief captain to be one thing on the battlefield, feared, ferocious, deadly, and another thing in a domestic situation, holding the hand of a little boy. In other words, this profession of arms doesn't turn men into killers per se. It turns them into noble men and women these days who defend that which is right and use means that are proper and proportionate, but as people, their husbands, fathers, gentle people. To me, it's always remarkable when I think back to the end of the last war. It was before my time, but you know that when the men who came back from the 6 years conflict in the war, they had seen some terrible things. They had done things that in other situations they would have never done. But with their rifles, machine guns, bayonets, and so on, they had to kill the enemy in order to prevent a worse evil. And yet they came back home after the war, demobbed, husbands, fathers, back to their jobs, ordinary people. The profession of arms. And it's a reminder in passing that this calling is a noble calling. I remember when I went with our son Andrew, when he joined up in the army and was sworn in. It's quite an impressive swearing-in ceremony. He was 17 at the time, not 18, so I had to be with him as his father. And he had to repeat this solemn oath on the Bible, swearing allegiance to the Queen and to defend the country and so on. And the recruiting sergeant said to me, knowing I was a minister, he said, your son, he said, joining the army, especially the Welsh Guards, he said, that's not a very spiritual thing, is it? And I said, no, it isn't maybe, but I said, it's a noble and a good calling, and I've got no problem with it. I don't think we ever should have. And that's a very wonderful thing, and thank God for it, because we owe so much of our freedom and peace and blessings to that very thing, don't we? So, the chief captain hears the story from the lips of this boy, and it leads to preventive action. Verse 22. He brings together an armed guard, and my word, certainly quite an armed guard against 40-odd Jews, 200 soldiers, 70 spearmen, 200 soldiers, horsemen, 70, and spearmen, 200, to give Paul an armed escort on his journey from his prison to the place of the Sanhedrin. There's no way at all those Jews could have come near Paul to ambush him. Now, I wonder what the 40 Jews did afterwards. They would have been pretty hungry and thirsty because they never got to kill Paul. It's an interesting question as to whether they kept the curse and the oath, or whether somehow or other conveniently they broke it. But you see, here is an instance of the Lord using a young, unnamed boy to fulfill his great purposes. You think of 2 Kings 5, the little maid in Naaman's household who mentions the prophet Elisha to her. And it leads to Naaman the Syrian's healing in the waters of Jordan by a miracle, and is coming to worship the true God. A little girl, a little boy. God uses small things. In 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 27, you've got those remarkable words that remind us, God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and base things of the world, and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. And so God is pleased to use small, weak, insignificant means and instruments so that all the glory will be his. Do you feel insignificant? Well, if we do, and we should, we are the very ones that the Lord is pleased to use and make a blessing to others so that he has the glory. And the smaller, the more insignificant, the better, so that the Lord will have all the praise. Remember what Samuel the prophet said to King Saul in 1 Samuel 15, verse 17, when thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made head of the tribes of Israel? When you were humble, Saul, when you thought little of yourself, when you said, who am I among all my father's house and the tribes of Israel that I should be? When you were like that, then you could be used. But he grew proud, full of importance, rebelled, disobeyed, and that was his downfall. And you know that our Lord says, he that exalteth himself shall be abased, but he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. And our humbling is the way to be blessed and to be used. And so a young boy, it reminds us that whatever little we might do, and even though with limited gifts and influence, that little can figure largely in the purposes of God. What an encouraging thought. A young boy. But then, secondly, a great man. Over into chapter 25. And now there is another plot from other Jews. And they want Festus now, because it's 2 years later in Caesarea, and the new Roman governor Festus has come into the place of Felix. And he visits Jerusalem, and he asks, the Jews ask him that Paul might be brought from Caesarea to Jerusalem to answer further charges. Verse 3, chapter 25, desired favor against him that he would send for him, that's Paul, to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. So again, Paul's life is in danger. And again, there is this possibility of a second journey that's going to be involving ambush and assassination. What does God do now? Well, look, verse 4. But, this is God's but. Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart to Jerusalem and hear what they've got to say. And isn't that remarkable? So Paul is kept in the castle, in the fort, not allowed to go to Jerusalem, and so is kept safe. And so it's through Festus now, this great man, who refuses the request of the Jews and insists that Paul stay where he is. Now, there's only one explanation of that. He imagined he was doing what he wanted, but of course, lying behind all such things in a world that is governed by God, Proverbs 16 verse 1, the preparations of the heart in man and the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So whatever man thinks, whatever answer he gives, it's God who's in control, not him. And then you've got it again, of course, the well-known verse, chapter 21 and verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. The highest, most powerful, in the hand of the Lord, not in his own hand. And so the Lord moved Festus to give this answer to the Jews. See, on behalf of Paul, powerful people think they exercise their authority and do as they want. But a higher power turns them for God's people. God is infinitely higher and over everything. Now, you could say that it was a human explanation as to why Festus answered like this. Maybe he refused the Jews' request because he'd heard that Paul had been before their council before and had collapsed into chaos and danger to Paul, and there was no result from that. So he will keep him in Caesarea for a hearing before the Roman tribunal and see what he can discover of why the Jews are so against Paul. So let the Jews come from Jerusalem to Caesarea, not take Paul from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Human explanation, perfectly logical. But you see, God works through human and ordinary means. So much so, it hardly seems like providence, this does it? But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, he himself would depart shortly thither, and so on. But no, it's a very human thing, but it's not ultimately human decisions done by, and works done by human hands. The governor's decision was what decided it, but it was the Lord's providence that decided that. We saw last week that there is such a thing as the wiles of the devil, and how that our great danger is because he cunningly hides himself and is lying in wait to deceive us, so that before even we realize we're listening to him and believing him, we're feeling accused, we're accepting things he's telling us. We think that the blasphemies in our minds and other wicked things in our minds are actually our thoughts when they're actually injected by him, and that we're not guilty of these things. And the devil so subtly and wilily deceives us and brings us down. But here is another who is also out of sight, the invisible presence of God with us always. We don't know, we don't see, but we see the results, our invisible guide and helper. And again I say, the marvel of divine providence is that it doesn't look like providence. And things that happen that are clearly the hand of God, when you actually look into it or see the result of it, it doesn't seem as if it's the hand of God, but he is there. And so you see, you never know, do you? When God is at work. In what is God working? Can be the most ordinary of events, And yet it can be extraordinary because it's the Lord working. As the poet puts it, he hides himself so wondrously as though there were no God. He is least seen when all the powers of ill are most abroad. Ah, God is other than we think. His ways are far above, far beyond reason's height, and reached only by childlike love. Do you believe that? You see, you go from this place, and you go in your car or whatever, going home, and you go into tomorrow, and in the next day, and the next day, and everything that is happening, you don't see, but God is there, and God is working, and God is ceaselessly, tirelessly at work. David the psalmist could say that he cries unto God most high, unto God that performeth all things for me. He's always at work. And you never know, do you? What will be the fruit, the outcome? How often the Lord has intervened and kept you safe. How often the Lord has appeared to supply your need by moving someone to help you. How often the devil has been thwarted and frustrated because the Lord has come and been our shield to protect us. But we live in a world of circumstances ruled and overruled by God. More than what is human and more than what is material and practical and all the rest of it. God is in it all. God is over it all. God is through it all. And great men figure in God's purposes. Great men. And you can look back, mentioning the Second World War earlier, you can look back at certain decisions that were made by Hitler, for instance. Foolish decisions, like the decision to invade Russia and open a front, an eastern front. That was crazy. And it's not as if it didn't have historical precedent. Napoleon tried to do that, and it was a disaster, and his army retreated in 1812, and it was the turning point in things. And so that was what? Well, it was arrogance, monumental arrogance, megalomania, thinking that he could take on the Russians and have another front and extend the Third Reich to the east. But it actually was the beginning of the end for him. And so God moves in mysterious ways. And people were praying back home in Britain, weren't they? You read the accounts of days of prayer called by George VI, and how that the population filled parish churches, and how that there were days of prayer for the Lord to have mercy upon our land and bless our alms and deliver us from Nazi tyranny. And these marvelous and wonderful things happened. You can't put these things down to just chance and stupid decisions by arrogant, crazy fools in power. You put it down to the intervention of God having mercy upon our nation. And it reminds us, doesn't it, that praying for the nation is a biblical duty, but it is a duty God blesses. And God still works in moving prime ministers, cabinet government, local authorities to do what's good and right for the furtherance of the gospel, the preservation of Christian liberties and freedom of speech, and so on. So God is over all that is great and in all that is great. Well, as we close, what can we learn from these things? Well, firstly, sometimes troubles come. And they certainly came to Paul, didn't they? The trouble that he encountered in Jerusalem when the Jews set upon him, when he was in the temple, and then before the Sanhedrin, and then the Romans arresting him, and trying to get out of him what the problem was and why he was so accused by the Jews and so on, and taken from pillar to post in great danger. Well, if our troubles are not of our own making, you can expect the Lord to help. Psalm 91, verse 15, I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. And you say, well, my troubles are often of my own making. Well, often mine are too. But even if they are, then still the Lord works round our mistakes and the things that we get wrong, and he can overrule them and turn them to good still. And if we look to him in our foolishness and mistakes, he will not turn us away, and he will still be with us in trouble, deliver us and honor us, and will learn from our mistakes and our follies and be the stronger and the better for them. But the Lord is with us, and while we are within the will of God, we are safe. And so it was with Paul. Proverbs 10, verse 9, he that walketh uprightly walketh surely. And when things are against you, things going wrong, worries, fears, keep to God's way, and you'll walk surely. And if obeying God means trouble, you're safer in trouble with God than in no trouble without him. God is the more glorified. Keep within the will of God. If you've strayed out of it, get back into it. And the Lord will be with you, and you'll walk surely. And thirdly, the Lord watches out for us when we cannot watch out for ourselves. What could Paul do for his own defense? Paul had no knowledge of these plots of the Jews, but God had knowledge. And one of them came to his ear through his nephew, and the other one was overruled by what Festus refused to do for the Jews. So the Lord was looking out. And dear friends, we don't see what might be around the corner. We do not know what's coming. But there's no need to worry. The Lord sees it. And the Lord is going before us and is with us. And so he watches out for us. As we sang earlier, Psalm 5, verse 12, for thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous. With favour wilt thou compass him as with a shield. Better than a Roman shield, better than a shield of spearmen and horsemen and soldiers, the Lord round about, compassing us with a shield, looking out for us when we are not looking out for ourselves because we can't. We don't know what is there. And then, lastly, fourthly, we are being guided more than we know. And how wonderful this is. Psalm 37, verse 23, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Steps, every step, one step at a time. Not even the course or the lifelong pilgrimage, although that's true, but the steps of a good man. One step at a time, one day at a time. Walk with God. And God will enlist whatever servants he needs to help us, to protect us. He has servants everywhere. And we talk about miracles, don't we? Some say that the church should be seeing miracles and signs and wonders again today. What we're talking about here, dear friends, is a standing miracle, a standing supernatural work of God's providence, divine and glorious. And this is happening all the time. These are the miracles we're interested in, not those that ceased with the passing of the apostles that had a temporary purpose for the church. We're talking about permanent miracles of grace and goodness, the providence of God that uses little things like a little lad, that uses great men like the Roman governor Festus, using anything and anybody, because we're precious in God's sight, and he takes pleasure in them that fear him. And what you count precious and what gives you pleasure, you protect and you look after. And so it is. May the Lord then bless his word and grant us the comfort and the encouragement for the glory of his name. Amen.